In the spring of 2019, a police cruiser rolled quietly down a residential street in Springfield, Ohio, moving with the kind of deliberate slowness that tells you something is about to break wide open. The officers inside weren't rushing. They'd waited 12 years for this moment. What they were about to do would shatter the carefully constructed life of someone the community had known, trusted, and never once suspected. But before we get to that knock on the door, before we understand how a case that seemed impossible to solve finally cracked open, we need to go back to where it all began, to a summer morning in 2007, when two little girls disappeared from a neighborhood that had never known this kind of fear. Before revealing how this single conversation, overheard by accident more than a decade later, would unravel a lie that had held firm through thousands of hours of investigation, please go ahead and subscribe. These stories are told to make sure the truth doesn't disappear with time. And here's something I want you to think about as you listen. If you knew something terrible had happened, if you suspected someone close to you had done something unforgivable, how long could you keep that secret? A week? A month? Could you carry it for 12 years? Springfield, Ohio, sits in Clark County, about 45 miles west of Columbus. It's the kind of place where people still leave their doors unlocked, where kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on, where everyone knows everyone else's business, or thinks they do. In 2007, the population hovered around 60,000. It was a community that had seen better days economically, but it held together through church potlucks, high school football games, and the shared belief that bad things happened somewhere else. The neighborhood where this story begins was working class, tree-lined, ordinary. Small houses with chain-link fences. Swing sets in backyards. The kind of place where children played outside all summer long. On the morning of July 14, 2007, two 5-year-old girls, Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes, were playing in Kayla's front yard. It was a Saturday. The temperature was already climbing toward 80 degrees by 9 in the morning. Both girls wore summer dresses, bright colors that their mothers had picked out the night before. Kayla's dress was yellow with white flowers. Brianna's was pink with butterflies. The two girls had been best friends since they were toddlers. Their mothers, Jennifer Morrison and Lisa Hayes, had met at a Mommy and Me class when the girls were just 6 months old, and the families had been close ever since. They lived 4 houses apart on Maple Avenue. The girls were inseparable. That morning, Jennifer Morrison was inside doing laundry. She could see the front yard through the living room window. She checked on the girls every few minutes, the way mothers do. She saw them playing with chalk on the sidewalk. She saw them running through the sprinkler. She saw them sitting in the grass, whispering to each other the way little girls do when they're sharing secrets. Lisa Hayes had dropped Brianna off around 8:30. She had errands to run, grocery shopping, a stop at the bank. She'd be back by noon, she told Jennifer. The plan was for both girls to have lunch together, maybe go to the community pool in the afternoon. At approximately 9:47 a.m., Jennifer went to the basement to switch a load of laundry from the washer to the dryer. She was gone for less than 5 minutes. When she came back upstairs and looked out the window, the front yard was empty. She wasn't immediately worried. The girls sometimes went to the backyard. Sometimes they went to the neighbor's house to pet their dog. She called out for Kayla. No answer. She walked through the house, checking each room. She went to the backyard. Empty. She walked back to the front, calling both girls' names now, her voice a little louder, a little tighter. She walked down the sidewalk, checking the neighbors' yards. Mrs. Patterson, 2 houses down, was watering her garden. She hadn't seen the girls. Mr. Chen, across the street, was washing his car. He'd seen them playing earlier, but not in the last 15 minutes. Jennifer felt the first cold touch of real fear. She called Lisa Hayes. Lisa answered on the second ring, and Jennifer could hear the instant shift in her voice when she said the girls weren't in the yard anymore. Lisa said she'd be there in 5 minutes. Jennifer called 911. The Springfield Police Department responded within minutes. What they found was a scene that offered almost nothing to work with. No signs of struggle. No witnesses who had seen anything unusual. The chalk was still on the sidewalk. The sprinkler was still running. 2 pairs of flip-flops sat abandoned in the grass, as if the girls had simply decided to walk away barefoot. But 5-year-olds don't just walk away. Not together. Not without telling anyone. The initial response was massive and immediate. Within an hour, more than 50 officers were searching the neighborhood. They went door to door. They checked every yard, every garage, every shed. They brought in K-9 units. The dogs picked up a scent that led to the end of the street, then stopped abruptly at the curb, which suggested the girls had gotten into a vehicle. That detail changed everything. This wasn't two little girls who had wandered off. This was an abduction. By noon, the neighborhood was swarming with law enforcement. The FBI was contacted. Amber Alerts were issued across Ohio and neighboring states. News helicopters circled overhead. Reporters set up on the corner of Maple Avenue, broadcasting live updates to a region that was collectively holding its breath. Jennifer Morrison and Lisa Hayes stood together in Jennifer's living room, surrounded by police officers asking questions they could barely process. What were the girls wearing? Did they talk to strangers? Had anyone unusual been in the neighborhood recently? Were there any custody disputes, any family conflicts, anyone who might have a reason to take the children? The questions felt surreal, impossible. These were 5-year-old girls who still believed in fairy tales. They had no enemies. They had no secrets. They were just children. The mothers answered every question. They gave the police photographs. They described the dresses, the flip-flops, the small details that defined their daughters. Kayla had a birthmark on her left shoulder, shaped like a tiny crescent moon. Brianna had recently lost her first tooth and was waiting for the tooth fairy. As you're listening to this, I'm curious, what time is it where you are right now? The search continued through the afternoon and into the evening. Volunteers arrived by the hundreds. They formed search lines and walked through fields, wooded areas, parks. They checked abandoned buildings, drainage ditches, every place a child could be hidden. They found nothing. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped, and Jennifer Morrison stood in her front yard, staring at the empty street, at the yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze. Somewhere out there, her daughter was missing. Somewhere, Brianna was missing. And the not knowing, the terrible, vast emptiness of not knowing, was beginning to settle over both families like a weight that would never lift. The investigation in those first 48 hours was relentless. Detectives interviewed more than 200 people. They reviewed security footage from every business within a 5-mile radius. They tracked down registered sex offenders in the area and accounted for their whereabouts. They executed search warrants on multiple properties. They followed every lead, no matter how small. But there were no witnesses. No one had seen a vehicle stop on Maple Avenue. No one had heard screaming or crying. No one had noticed anything out of the ordinary. It was as if Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes had simply vanished into the summer air. The families became the public face of the search. Jennifer Morrison and Lisa Hayes appeared at press conferences, their faces pale and drawn, their voices breaking as they pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. They begged whoever had taken their daughters to bring them home. They said they wouldn't press charges. They just wanted their babies back. Michael Morrison, Kayla's father, worked construction. He was a quiet man, the kind who solved problems with his hands, not his words. The helplessness destroyed him. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't build or repair his way out of this nightmare. He spent hours driving around Springfield, searching places the police had already searched, looking for something, anything, that might bring his daughter home. David Hayes, Brianna's father, was a mechanic. He and Lisa had separated 2 years earlier but remained on good terms for Brianna's sake. When he got the call that his daughter was missing, he was at work, elbows deep in an engine repair. He dropped everything and drove straight to Springfield from his apartment in Dayton. He wouldn't leave for weeks. The neighborhood transformed. Maple Avenue became a place of vigils and prayer circles. People tied yellow ribbons around trees. They placed stuffed animals and flowers on the sidewalk where the girls had last been seen. They organized search parties that continued long after the official searches had been scaled back. The community couldn't accept that 2 little girls could disappear without a trace. But as the days stretched into weeks, the reality began to settle in. The chances of finding Kayla and Brianna alive were diminishing with every passing hour. On July 29, 15 days after the girls disappeared, a man walking his dog in a wooded area near Buck Creek, about 7 miles from Maple Avenue, found a small yellow dress caught in the underbrush near the water's edge. It was Kayla's dress, the one with white flowers. It was torn and muddy, but there was no blood on it. There was no other evidence nearby, no other clothing, no shoes, no indication of what had happened. 2 days later, a fisherman discovered Brianna's pink dress in the same general area, about a quarter mile upstream from where Kayla's dress had been found. Again, no blood. No other physical evidence. Just the dresses, discarded like they meant nothing. The discovery of the dresses brought searchers back to Buck Creek in force. Divers went into the water. Cadaver dogs combed the surrounding woods. Volunteers searched every inch of the area for days. What they were looking for now, everyone understood, were bodies. But they found nothing. No trace of Kayla Morrison or Brianna Hayes. The investigation shifted. If the girls' bodies weren't in Buck Creek, if there was no evidence of how they died or where they might be buried, then detectives were left with one terrible conclusion: someone had taken the time to hide them. Someone had been careful. Someone had planned this. The profile of the offender began to take shape in the minds of investigators. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This was someone who knew the neighborhood, who knew the girls' routines, who knew when and how to strike. This was someone organized enough to avoid leaving evidence, disciplined enough to stay silent while an entire community searched in desperation. That assumption would follow the case for years. Detectives focused heavily on the families. In cases involving missing children, statistically, the perpetrator is often someone close to the victim. They looked at Michael Morrison. They looked at David Hayes. They looked at extended family members, family friends, anyone who had regular access to the girls. Both fathers submitted to polygraph tests. Both passed. Both allowed their homes to be searched repeatedly. Both cooperated fully, even as the scrutiny wore them down, even as they saw the suspicion in people's eyes. Jennifer Morrison and Lisa Hayes were also interviewed extensively. Their movements on the morning of July 14 were accounted for down to the minute. They were never seriously considered suspects, but the investigation left no stone unturned, no relationship unexamined. Detectives interviewed teachers, babysitters, neighbors, church members. They built timelines. They created maps. They analyzed phone records and financial transactions. They did everything right, by the book, the way you're supposed to investigate a case like this. But they came up empty. Every lead turned into a dead end. Every promising tip led nowhere. The case began to grow cold. By the fall of 2007, the active search had largely ended. The FBI scaled back its involvement. The press moved on to other stories. Life in Springfield returned to a painful, incomplete kind of normal. But for the Morrison and Hayes families, nothing would ever be normal again. Jennifer Morrison stopped sleeping through the night. She would wake at 2, 3, 4 in the morning, convinced she'd heard Kayla calling for her. She'd walk through the house, checking rooms she knew were empty. She kept Kayla's bedroom exactly as it had been. The bed still made. The stuffed animals arranged on the shelf. The little shoes lined up by the closet. Lisa Hayes couldn't stay in Springfield. The memories were too sharp, too constant. She moved to Columbus within a year, trying to outrun the grief. It didn't work. Wherever she went, Brianna went with her, in every little girl she saw, in every laugh she heard, in every moment that should have been but would never be. The investigation continued, but it moved slowly. Detective Raymond Lucas, who had been assigned as the lead investigator, refused to let the case go cold. He kept the file on his desk. He reviewed the evidence regularly. He followed up on tips that came in, even years later, even when most of them led nowhere. Lucas was in his late 40s when Kayla and Brianna disappeared. He'd been with the Springfield Police Department for more than 20 years. He'd worked homicides, narcotics, violent crimes. But this case haunted him in a way nothing else ever had. 2 little girls, vanished in broad daylight. No witnesses. No bodies. No justice. He thought about them often. He wondered if they'd suffered. He wondered if they'd been scared. He wondered if, in those final moments, they'd called out for their mothers. Over the years, there were occasional breaks in the case that seemed promising but ultimately went nowhere. In 2009, a man in Columbus confessed to killing 2 children and burying them in a rural area outside the city. Detectives drove out to interview him. He couldn't provide details that matched Kayla and Brianna's case. He was mentally ill, seeking attention. The confession was false. In 2011, an anonymous tip came in claiming that a man who used to live on Maple Avenue had been involved. Detectives tracked him down. He'd moved to Kentucky. They interviewed him, searched his property. There was no evidence connecting him to the girls. In 2013, a woman called the tip line saying she'd had a vision about where the girls were buried. Detectives followed up, more out of obligation than belief. There was nothing there. The year passed. Kayla and Brianna would have turned 10, then 15, then 18. Their families aged in ways that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with grief. Michael and Jennifer Morrison's marriage didn't survive. They divorced in 2010, both of them too broken to hold each other up anymore. David Hayes remarried and had another daughter, but he never stopped searching for Brianna. Lisa Hayes never remarried. She never had more children. She said she couldn't. It would feel like replacing Brianna, and Brianna could never be replaced. Springfield moved on, the way communities do. New families moved into the neighborhood. The yellow ribbons faded and were taken down. The flowers and stuffed animals were eventually cleared away. Maple Avenue looked like any other street again. But some people didn't forget. Detective Lucas didn't forget. The case files sat in his office, growing thicker but not closer to resolution. He knew, statistically, that after this much time, the chances of solving the case were nearly zero. But he also knew that cold cases did get solved sometimes. Years later. Decades later. When someone's conscience finally broke, or when a secret became too heavy to carry. He just had to wait for that moment to come. What no one realized at the time was that the break in the case wouldn't come from forensics or a confession or even a new witness. It would come from something far more human and far more fragile, a conversation between 2 women who had carried a terrible weight for more than a decade, and one of them was finally starting to crack. In early 2019, a woman named Rebecca Lawson was sitting in a coffee shop in Springfield, meeting with her sister, Angela. The two hadn't been close for years. Angela lived in Cincinnati now. She'd moved away not long after 2007, and the distance between them had been more than geographic. But Rebecca had reached out recently, saying she needed to talk. Saying there was something she couldn't carry anymore. Angela thought it was about their mother's declining health. She thought it was about money or family drama, the kind of thing sisters work through over coffee and awkward silences. But when Rebecca started talking, Angela realized this was something else entirely. Rebecca's hands were shaking. She kept looking around the coffee shop, making sure no one was sitting close enough to hear. She started by talking about her marriage, how it had been difficult, how her husband, Nathan Lawson, had changed over the years. How there were things she'd ignored, things she'd rationalized, because admitting them would mean admitting that she'd spent years living with a man she didn't really know. Angela listened, confused about where this was going. Then Rebecca said something that made Angela's blood run cold. She said she thought Nathan had done something terrible. She said she thought he'd been involved in what happened to those 2 little girls back in 2007. Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes. Angela stared at her sister, unable to process what she was hearing. She asked Rebecca what she meant. What had Nathan said? What did she know? Rebecca started to cry. She said she didn't have proof. She said she couldn't be sure. But there had been things over the years, things Nathan had said when he was drunk, things he'd let slip in anger, things that didn't add up. She said he'd been acting strange in the days after the girls disappeared. He'd been anxious, paranoid. He'd insisted they get rid of his truck, even though there was nothing wrong with it. He'd made her lie to the police about where he'd been that morning. She said she'd convinced herself for years that it didn't mean anything. That she was being paranoid. That the stress of living through something like that, two little girls disappearing from their own neighborhood, had made everyone act strange. But she couldn't convince herself anymore. Angela didn't know what to do with this information. Part of her wanted to dismiss it. Rebecca had always been dramatic, prone to exaggeration. But something in the way her sister was talking, the fear in her eyes, the way her voice broke, made Angela believe this was real. She told Rebecca she needed to go to the police. Rebecca shook her head. She said she couldn't. She said Nathan would know. She said he'd hurt her. She said she had 2 kids with him now, and she couldn't risk it. Angela left that coffee shop feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her. She didn't sleep that night. She kept thinking about those 2 little girls. She kept thinking about their mothers, still waiting for answers after all these years. The next morning, Angela called the Springfield Police Department. She asked to speak to someone about the Morrison and Hayes case. She was transferred to Detective Raymond Lucas. Lucas listened as Angela explained what her sister had told her. He asked careful, measured questions. He didn't dismiss her. He didn't tell her this was nothing. He asked if Rebecca would be willing to talk to him directly. Angela said she'd try. It took 2 weeks for Rebecca Lawson to agree to meet with Detective Lucas. She was terrified. She insisted the meeting be somewhere outside Springfield, somewhere Nathan wouldn't see her. Lucas agreed. They met at a diner in Dayton. Rebecca told Lucas everything she'd told her sister, and more. She said Nathan Lawson had grown up in Springfield. He'd lived on Maple Avenue in 2007, just 3 houses down from where Kayla Morrison lived. He'd known the families. He'd been friendly with the neighbors. He'd been there the day the girls disappeared, sitting on his porch, watching the search unfold. Rebecca said that in the weeks after the girls went missing, Nathan had become obsessed with the case. He'd followed the news constantly. He'd talked about it incessantly. But there was something off about the way he talked, like he was testing how much people knew, like he was measuring the investigation's progress. She said he'd made her lie to the police when they came door to door asking if anyone had seen anything. He'd told her to say he'd been home all morning, working in the garage. But she knew that wasn't true. She'd woken up late that morning, it had been a Saturday, and when she came downstairs around 10, Nathan wasn't home. His truck was gone. He didn't come back until afternoon. When she'd asked him where he'd been, he'd snapped at her. Told her to mind her own business. Then, later that night, after the news broke about the missing girls, he'd told her if anyone asked, she needed to say he'd been home. He made her promise. He said it was important. Lucas asked why she'd gone along with it. Rebecca started to cry again. She said she was young back then, only 23. She said she'd been scared of Nathan. He had a temper. He'd never hit her, but he had a way of making her feel small, worthless. She said she'd learned early in their relationship that it was easier to do what he said than to question him. Lucas asked if Nathan had ever explicitly said he'd hurt the girls. Rebecca shook her head. No. Nothing that direct. But there had been moments over the years, times when they'd argued, times when he'd been drinking, when he'd said things that haunted her. Once, during a fight in 2011, he'd shouted that she had no idea what he was capable of. That he'd done things she couldn't imagine, and if she ever tried to leave him, he'd make sure she regretted it. Another time, in 2015, they'd been watching a true crime show about a child abduction. Nathan had made a comment, almost offhand, about how stupid the guy on TV had been. How he'd left too much evidence. How if you were going to do something like that, you had to be smarter. Rebecca had asked him what he meant. He'd looked at her with an expression she couldn't read and said, nothing. Just talking. Lucas took detailed notes. He asked Rebecca if she would be willing to testify if it came to that. She said she didn't know. She said she was terrified of what Nathan would do if he found out she'd talked to the police. Lucas assured her they would move carefully. He asked if there was any physical evidence, anything Nathan might have kept, anything that could tie him to the crime. Rebecca thought for a long time. Then she said there was a storage unit. Nathan had rented a storage unit about a year after the girls disappeared. He'd told her it was for old tools and junk from the garage. He'd made it clear she was never to go there. He was the only one with a key. Lucas felt the first real surge of hope he'd felt in years. Over the next several weeks, Detective Lucas and his team moved quietly. They ran background checks on Nathan Lawson. They pulled his financial records, his phone records from 2007, his vehicle registrations. They built a timeline of his movements and activities in the days surrounding July 14. What they found was troubling. Nathan Lawson had no alibi for the morning the girls disappeared. His work schedule showed he'd had that Saturday off. His phone records showed no calls made or received between 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. that day. His truck, a dark blue Ford F-150, had been sold for scrap just 3 weeks after the girls went missing, despite having relatively low mileage and no mechanical issues. They also found something else, a restraining order filed against Nathan in 2003 by an ex-girlfriend who'd accused him of stalking and threatening behavior. The case had been dropped when the woman moved out of state, but it painted a picture of someone with a history of control, obsession, and intimidation. Lucas knew this wasn't enough for an arrest. Everything they had was circumstantial. The lies Rebecca described, the suspicious behavior, the disposal of the truck, it all pointed toward Nathan Lawson, but it didn't prove anything. They needed more. Lucas obtained a warrant to search the storage unit Rebecca had mentioned. On a cold morning in March 2019, he and a team of officers drove out to a facility on the outskirts of Springfield. Unit 247. Nathan Lawson's name was on the rental agreement. They cut the lock and opened the door. Inside, they found exactly what Nathan had claimed: old tools, boxes of junk, garage clutter. Lucas felt the first wave of disappointment. But he didn't give up. He ordered everything removed, everything catalogued and searched. It took hours. They went through every box, every drawer, every piece of rusted equipment. And then, in the very back of the unit, behind a stack of paint cans and rotting cardboard boxes, they found a small duffel bag. Inside the bag were 2 pairs of children's flip-flops. One pair was pink. One pair was yellow with white daisies. The same flip-flops Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes had been wearing the day they disappeared. Lucas stood there in that storage unit, staring at those tiny shoes, and felt something break open inside him. 12 years. 12 years of searching, waiting, hoping. And here it was. Proof. Not circumstantial. Not hearsay. Proof. Also in the duffel bag were several photographs. Polaroids. They showed a wooded area, trees, a creek. Lucas recognized it immediately: Buck Creek, the same area where the girls' dresses had been found. The photos had been taken from different angles, like someone documenting a location. There was also a small notebook. Inside, written in Nathan Lawson's handwriting, were what appeared to be notes. Fragmentary, disjointed. East Bank access clear. No cameras past Route 4. Dispose before noon. It was the kind of documentation someone would keep if they were planning something. Or if they were reliving it. Lucas called the prosecutor's office. He called the FBI. He made sure every piece of evidence was photographed, catalogued, and secured in a way that would hold up in court. Then he called Rebecca Lawson and told her they had enough. On March 28, 2019, Nathan Lawson was arrested at his place of employment, a warehouse in Springfield where he worked as a shipping supervisor. He was taken into custody without incident. He didn't ask why he was being arrested. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He just stared straight ahead, silent. In the interrogation room, Detective Lucas sat across from Nathan Lawson and laid out what they'd found. The storage unit. The flip-flops. The photographs. The notebook. Nathan said nothing. He didn't deny it. He didn't confess. He just sat there, stone-faced, as Lucas talked. Lucas asked him directly, "Did you kill Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes?" Nathan Lawson leaned back in his chair and said, "I want a lawyer." The interview ended there. The arrest made headlines across Ohio. After 12 years, there was finally a suspect in custody. Jennifer Morrison and Lisa Hayes were notified before the news went public. Both women broke down when they heard. It wasn't relief they felt, not yet. It was something closer to disbelief. After so long, after so much silence, someone was finally being held accountable. But accountability and justice are not the same thing. And in the months that followed, the gap between those two words would become painfully clear. Nathan Lawson was charged with 2 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and 2 counts of gross abuse of a corpse. The prosecution's case rested on the physical evidence found in the storage unit, the lies Nathan had told in 2007, and the testimony of his estranged wife, Rebecca. Rebecca Lawson filed for divorce and full custody of their children within days of Nathan's arrest. She agreed to testify against him. She told the grand jury everything, the lies, the coercion, the things Nathan had said over the years that had made her suspect the worst. But the defense fought back hard. Nathan's attorney argued that the evidence in the storage unit had been planted. He claimed Rebecca was a scorned wife with an agenda. He argued that the flip-flops, while disturbing, didn't prove Nathan had killed anyone. They didn't prove he'd even been the one to take them. He pointed out that there was no DNA evidence, no murder weapon, no confession, and, most critically, no bodies. Without bodies, the defense argued, there was no proof the girls were even dead. They could have been taken by someone else. They could have been sold. They could be alive somewhere. It was a desperate argument, but it planted seeds of doubt. The trial began in October 2019. It lasted 6 weeks. The courtroom was packed every single day. Jennifer Morrison and Lisa Hayes sat in the front row, side by side, the way they'd sat through search parties and vigils and press conferences 12 years earlier. They listened to every word of testimony. They looked at Nathan Lawson every single day, searching his face for some sign of remorse, some acknowledgement of what he'd done. They never saw it. Nathan sat at the defense table, expressionless, detached, as if the trial had nothing to do with him. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically. They showed the jury the flip-flops. They showed the photographs of Buck Creek. They showed the notebook with its chilling, fragmented notes. They brought Rebecca Lawson to the stand, and she testified for 2 full days, describing her life with Nathan, the lies he'd made her tell, the fear that had kept her silent. The defense cross-examined her brutally. They accused her of fabricating her story to gain leverage in the divorce. They pointed out inconsistencies in her timeline. They suggested she was unstable, unreliable, motivated by revenge. Rebecca held her ground. She said she knew what she knew. She said she'd lived with the weight of it for 12 years, and she wasn't going to carry it anymore. The prosecution also called Detective Raymond Lucas to the stand. He walked the jury through the investigation, the years of dead ends, the moment the case had finally broken open. He testified about Nathan's behavior in 2007, the disposal of the truck, the storage unit, the evidence they'd found. The defense attacked the integrity of the search. They argued the warrant had been too broad. They argued the evidence should be suppressed. The judge denied the motion, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The most difficult part of the trial, for everyone in that courtroom, was the absence of Kayla and Brianna themselves. The prosecution couldn't show the jury how the girls had died. They couldn't explain exactly what had happened after Nathan had taken them. They could only show what came after, the discarded dresses, the hidden shoes, the photographs of a burial site that had never yielded bodies. It was enough to paint a picture, but it wasn't enough to eliminate all doubt. After 6 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for 4 days. On November 18, 2019, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty on 2 counts of aggravated murder. Guilty on 2 counts of kidnapping. Guilty on 2 counts of gross abuse of a corpse. The courtroom erupted. Jennifer Morrison collapsed into her sister's arms, sobbing. Lisa Hayes sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Michael Morrison, sitting in the back of the courtroom, dropped his head into his hands and wept. Nathan Lawson showed no reaction. He stared straight ahead, expressionless, as the judge read the verdict. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge sentenced Nathan Lawson to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each murder count, to be served consecutively. He would never leave prison. He would die there. Before the sentence was handed down, the judge allowed victim impact statements. Jennifer Morrison stood at the podium, her voice shaking but clear. She said Kayla would have been 17 years old. She said Kayla had wanted to be a veterinarian. She said Kayla had loved butterflies and strawberries and the color yellow. She said Nathan Lawson had taken all of that away, not just from Kayla, but from everyone who loved her. She said he'd taken 12 years of waiting, of not knowing, of hoping against hope that maybe, somehow, Kayla was still alive. She looked directly at Nathan and said, "You don't get to forget what you did. And we won't let the world forget either." Lisa Hayes spoke next. She said Brianna had been a gentle child, shy around strangers but full of laughter with the people she loved. She said Brianna had been afraid of thunderstorms, and Lisa had spent 12 years wondering if her daughter had been scared at the end. Wondering if she'd cried for her mother. She said the hardest part wasn't even the grief. It was the not knowing. It was the fact that Nathan Lawson had refused to tell them where he'd buried the girls. He'd taken that final piece of closure and kept it for himself, one last act of cruelty. She said, "I hope you live a long, long life in prison. I hope you have to think about what you did every single day. I hope it haunts you the way it's haunted us." Nathan Lawson was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He never looked back. Even with the conviction, the case wasn't fully closed. Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes were still missing. Detective Lucas continued to work the case, continued to search for their remains. He interviewed Nathan multiple times in prison, trying to get him to reveal where he'd buried them. Nathan never said a word. He invoked his right to silence and refused to cooperate. In 2021, a team of forensic specialists and cadaver dogs conducted an extensive search of the Buck Creek area based on the photographs found in Nathan's storage unit. They searched for weeks, covering more than 50 acres of wooded land. They found nothing. To this day, Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes have not been found. Their families hold memorial services every year on July 14th. They gather at a small park in Springfield where a bench has been placed in the girls' memory. The bench is inscribed with both their names and a single line, "Loved. Remembered. Never forgotten." Jennifer Morrison still lives in Springfield. She says she can't leave. She says as long as Kayla is out there somewhere, she needs to stay close. She needs to be here in case someone finds her. Lisa Hayes moved back to Springfield after the trial. She said she needed to be near people who remembered Brianna, who still said her name out loud. Detective Raymond Lucas retired in 2022. He spent his final years on the force working cold cases, helping other families find answers the way he'd helped the Morrisons and the Hayes. He says the case changed him. He says it taught him that justice doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Sometimes justice is just the truth coming to light, even if it comes too late. If you're still listening to this, you're someone who believes that even when justice arrives decades late, it still matters. There's a strange mathematics to a case like this, one that doesn't add up the way you want it to. On one side of the equation, you have a conviction, a man behind bars for the rest of his life, a community that finally knows who took 2 little girls from a front yard on a summer morning. On the other side, you have 2 families who will never hold their daughters again, who will never know exactly what happened in those final hours, who will never be able to lay flowers on a grave because there is no grave to visit. Rebecca Lawson disappeared from public life after the trial. She changed her name, moved out of state with her children, and has never spoken publicly about Nathan or the case since her testimony. Those who know her say she carries her own kind of grief, the grief of having loved someone capable of something unthinkable, the grief of knowing she could have spoken sooner but didn't, the grief of living with questions she'll never be able to answer. Could she have stopped him? Could she have saved those girls if she'd trusted her instincts earlier? The weight of those questions is something she'll carry for the rest of her life. Angela, Rebecca's sister, gave one interview to a local newspaper in 2020. She said she thought about that conversation in the coffee shop almost every day. She said she was grateful Rebecca had finally found the courage to speak, but she also understood the cost of that courage. She said her sister had lost everything: her marriage, her sense of safety, her faith that she could trust her own judgment. Angela said Rebecca had done the right thing, but doing the right thing doesn't always make the pain go away. Springfield changed after the trial in ways both visible and invisible. The neighborhood on Maple Avenue looks the same as it did in 2007, same houses, same trees, same quiet streets. But the people who live there now carry the story with them. New families who move and eventually learn what happened. They hear it from neighbors, or they find old news articles online, and they stand in their front yards and look at the sidewalk and think about two little girls who played there once and never came home. There's a particular kind of haunting that settles over a place where something terrible has happened. It's not ghosts or supernatural presence. It's memory made physical. It's the way a mother walking her child to school grips her daughter's hand a little tighter when she passes that corner. It's the way people lock their doors now, even in the middle of the day, even when they never used to. It's the collective understanding that bad things can happen anywhere, to anyone, even in a place that seems safe. The case changed how Springfield thought about safety. In the years following Kayla and Brianna's disappearance, the community implemented new measures: neighborhood watch programs, child safety workshops, a more robust alert system for missing persons. None of it could bring the girls back, but it was something. It was action in the face of helplessness. For the families, the years after Nathan Lawson's conviction brought a complicated kind of peace. Not closure. Closure is a word people use when they don't understand grief. There is no closing a wound this deep. But there was something. There was the knowledge that the person responsible would never hurt another child. There was the certainty that they hadn't been wrong to keep hoping, keep pushing, keep believing that someday the truth would surface. Jennifer Morrison has become an advocate for families of missing children. She works with a nonprofit organization that provides support and resources to parents navigating the nightmare of a missing child. She says it's the only way she's found to make meaning out of what happened to Kayla. She can't save her own daughter, but she can help other families find their way through the darkness. In interviews, Jennifer is careful never to say she's moved on. She says that phrase bothers her, as if grief were a place you could leave behind, as if loving Kayla were something that happened in the past tense. She says Kayla is still her daughter. Present tense. Always. She keeps Kayla's room the same. The bed with its yellow comforter. The stuffed animals. The books on the shelf. Friends have gently suggested that maybe it's time to let go, to donate the clothes, to turn the room into something else. Jennifer always shakes her head. She says when Kayla is found, not if, when, she wants her daughter to come home to a room that remembers her. Lisa Hayes has channeled her grief differently. She became a photographer, specializing in family portraits. She says there's something sacred about capturing moments, about creating images that prove a person existed, that they were loved, that they mattered. She thinks often about the photographs she has of Brianna. There aren't as many as she wishes. In 2007, people didn't carry cameras in their pockets the way they do now. Every photo was intentional, planned. She has maybe 50 pictures of her daughter. She's memorized every one. She says the hardest part is watching Brianna stay 5 years old in those photographs while the world keeps aging around her. She sees children who would have been Brianna's classmates graduating high school, going to college, getting married. She wonders who Brianna would have become. What she would have loved. Who she would have been. There's a particular cruelty in losing a child so young. You lose not just who they were, but who they would have become. You lose every milestone, every achievement, every moment of joy and heartbreak and growth. You lose a future you'll never get to see. Michael Morrison struggled more than anyone to find a way forward. The divorce from Jennifer in 2010 had been quiet, inevitable. They'd both known it was coming. Grief had built a wall between them that neither could climb over. They loved each other, in a way, but they couldn't be in the same room without seeing Kayla's absence reflected in each other's eyes. Michael threw himself into work. He took extra shifts, overtime, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. But construction work is repetitive, and repetitive work leaves room for thoughts to wander. He thought about the morning Kayla disappeared. He thought about the fact that he'd been at a job site 20 minutes away, unaware that his daughter was being taken. He thought about how he should have been home. How if he'd been home, maybe he would have seen something, stopped something. Guilt is its own kind of prison. Michael carried his for years before he finally sought help. A therapist told him what everyone had been trying to tell him, that he couldn't have known, couldn't have stopped it, wasn't responsible for the actions of a man like Nathan Lawson. Michael understood the logic of that. But understanding something intellectually and believing it emotionally are two different things. He's doing better now. He remarried in 2018, to a woman named Sarah who's kind and patient and understands that Kayla will always be part of his life. They have a son together. Michael says becoming a father again terrified him in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He says he sees danger everywhere now. He checks the locks 3 times before bed. He doesn't let his son play outside unsupervised, not even for a minute. Sarah understands. She never complains. On the anniversary of Kayla's disappearance each year, Michael takes the day off work. He drives to the memorial bench in the park and sits there for hours. Sometimes Jennifer is there too. Sometimes Lisa. Sometimes all 3 of them sit together in silence, bound by a loss that no one else can fully understand. David Hayes, Brianna's father, moved away from Ohio entirely. He said he couldn't stay. The memories were too heavy, the reminders too constant. He lives in Oregon now, on the coast, about as far from Springfield as he could get while staying in the continental United States. He has a daughter from his second marriage, a little girl named Emma who's 8 years old now. He says he's never told Emma about Brianna. He doesn't know how. He doesn't know how to explain to an 8-year-old that she has a sister she'll never meet, that her father carries a grief so deep it has its own gravity. He knows he'll have to tell her eventually. He's just waiting for the right time. Though he suspects there will never be a right time for a conversation like that. David stays in touch with Lisa. They talk on the phone every few weeks, checking in, making sure the other is okay. They're bonded in a way that transcends their failed marriage, bonded by the fact that they created Brianna together, loved her together, and lost her together. That kind of bond doesn't break, even when everything else does. Detective Raymond Lucas retired with the case still technically open. He handed his files over to a younger detective, a woman named Maria Alvarez, who promised to keep searching, to keep hoping that someday Nathan Lawson would break, or someone would come forward with information, or the Woods would finally give up what they've been hiding. Lucas spent his last day at the Springfield Police Department sitting at his desk, looking at the photograph of Kayla and Brianna that he'd kept pinned to his bulletin board for 12 years. 2 little girls in summer dresses, smiling at the camera, unaware of what was coming. He thought about all the hours he'd spent on this case. The sleepless nights. The dead ends. The moment in that storage unit when he'd found the flip-flops and felt the case finally crack open. He thought about justice, and what it means, and whether they'd really achieved it. Nathan Lawson is serving his sentence at the Mansfield Correctional Institution, a maximum security prison in north-central Ohio. According to public records, he's been written up multiple times for disciplinary infractions, fighting with other inmates, refusing orders from guards. He's been placed in solitary confinement on several occasions. He receives mail occasionally. Most of it is hate mail from people who read about the case, who wanted to tell him exactly what they think of him. He doesn't respond to any of it. He's never given a formal statement about what happened to Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes. He's never expressed remorse. He's never apologized to the families. He's never revealed where he buried the girls. In 2022, a journalist specializing in cold cases requested an interview with Nathan. The request was denied. Nathan's attorney released a brief statement saying his client had nothing to say and would not be participating in any media related to the case. There have been periodic efforts to find the girls' remains. Search teams return to the Buck Creek area every few years, using new technology, new methods, hoping that something will turn up. So far, nothing has. Some investigators believe Nathan disposed of the bodies in a way that makes discovery nearly impossible, perhaps in a body of water, or by burying them deep in a remote location he's never revealed. Others believe the remains are somewhere in that wooded area near Buck Creek, just waiting to be found. It's possible they've been searched over, walked past, missed by mere feet. The not knowing is its own kind of torture for the families. Jennifer Morrison has said in interviews that she dreams about finding Kayla. In the dreams, she's walking through the woods and she sees something, a flash of yellow, a piece of fabric, a sign. She follows it and finds her daughter, finally, and she can bring her home. She wakes from these dreams with a hope that lasts for about 30 seconds before reality settles back in. The case has been featured on several true crime television programs over the years. Dateline NBC did an hour-long special in 2020. 48 Hours covered it in 2021. Each time, the story reaches a new audience, and each time, the families hope that someone watching might remember something, might know something, might come forward with the one piece of information that could lead them to Kayla and Brianna. But the years keep passing, and the girls remain missing. There's a question that hangs over this case, one that people ask in different ways but that always comes down to the same thing: why? Why did Nathan Lawson take two little girls who'd never done anything to him? Why did he kill them? What could have possibly motivated such a senseless, cruel act? Psychologists who've studied the case from a distance, without ever having access to Nathan himself, since he's refused all psychological evaluation, have offered theories. Some suggest he fits the profile of a sadistic offender, someone who derives satisfaction from power and control, from inflicting suffering. Others suggest the crime may have been opportunistic, a terrible impulse acted upon in a moment when the opportunity presented itself. But these are just theories. Without Nathan's cooperation, without a confession, without insight into his mind, the why remains unanswered. And perhaps that's the final cruelty, not just taking these children, not just refusing to say where they are, but refusing to explain why any of it happened in the first place. For Jennifer Morrison and Lisa Hayes, the why matters less than it used to. In the early years, they were consumed by it. They needed to understand. They needed it to make sense. But after more than a decade of living with unanswered questions, they've learned that some things don't make sense. Some things can't be rationalized or explained. Some evil is just evil, and searching for logic in it is like searching for light in a void. What matters now, they say, is remembering. Making sure Kayla and Brianna aren't forgotten. Making sure their names are spoken, their stories told, their lives acknowledged as having mattered. The memorial bench in the park where the families gather each year has become a place of pilgrimage for people touched by the case. Strangers leave flowers there. They leave notes. They leave stuffed animals and photographs and handwritten prayers. The community maintains it carefully, making sure it's never vandalized, never neglected. Every year on Kayla and Brianna's birthday, they were born just 2 weeks apart, in late September, the families gather for a private celebration. They bring cupcakes. They sing "Happy Birthday." They tell stories about the girls, keeping their memories alive. Kayla would have been 23 years old in September 2025. Brianna would have been 22. 23 and 22. Old enough to have graduated college. Old enough to have careers, relationships, lives of their own. Old enough to be planning their futures, making their marks on the world. Instead, they're frozen at 5. Forever 5. Forever two little girls in summer dresses playing in a front yard on a Saturday morning. The ripple effects of this case extend far beyond the immediate families. The neighborhood children who were Kayla and Brianna's friends, the kids who played with them, who went to kindergarten with them, are adults now. Many of them have spoken about how the disappearance shaped their childhoods, how it ended a kind of innocence they didn't know they had. One woman, Emily Chen, who lived across the street and was 6 years old when Kayla and Brianna disappeared, said in a 2019 interview that she remembers the day vividly. She remembers seeing the police cars, the search teams, the news crews. She remembers her parents' fear, the way they suddenly became strict about where she could go and who she could talk to. She said it changed her understanding of the world. She realized for the first time that bad things could happen to children. That being a kid didn't protect you. She said she thinks about Kayla and Brianna often, especially now that she has children of her own. She said she's hypervigilant as a parent in ways she knows are probably excessive, but she can't help it. She knows what can happen in 5 minutes. She knows what can be lost. That's the legacy of a case like this, not just the immediate grief of the families who lost their children, but the ambient fear that settles over an entire community, an entire generation. The loss of the belief that children are safe, that neighborhoods are safe, that the world is fundamentally a good place where terrible things are rare exceptions. Springfield has had to reckon with that loss of innocence. The town has had to accept that evil doesn't just exist in big cities or faraway places. It exists everywhere. It can live 3 houses down from you. It can sit on a porch watching a search party look for the children it took. But alongside that darkness, there's also been light. The community has responded to this tragedy by coming together in ways that matter. They've created support networks for families of missing children. They've implemented safety programs in schools. They've trained volunteers in search and rescue techniques. They've refused to let fear paralyze them, choosing instead to channel it into action, into protection, into care for one another. There's a particular kind of strength required to live in the aftermath of something like this, to keep going, keep hoping, keep believing in goodness even when you've seen the worst humanity has to offer. The people of Springfield have shown that strength. The Morrison and Hayes families have shown it. And in doing so, they've honored Kayla and Brianna in a way that transcends the tragedy of their deaths. The case has also prompted conversations about how we investigate crimes involving children, how we support families through the nightmare of a missing child, how we balance the need for answers with the reality that sometimes answers don't come. Law enforcement agencies across the country have studied this case, looking at what worked, what didn't, what could be improved. One of the key takeaways has been the importance of preserving evidence, even when a case seems to be going nowhere. The fact that Detective Lucas kept the case file active, kept reviewing evidence, kept himself available for any new leads, that's what made it possible to act quickly when Rebecca Lawson finally came forward. If the case had been truly closed, if the evidence had been filed away and forgotten, that storage unit might never have been searched. There's also been discussion about the role of witness testimony, particularly from people like Rebecca who are afraid to come forward. How do you create an environment where someone feels safe enough to speak up, even when they're terrified of the consequences? How do you encourage people to trust law enforcement when they've spent years protecting themselves by staying silent? These are questions without easy answers, but they're important questions. And cases like this one force us to grapple with them. For Detective Raymond Lucas, retirement hasn't meant letting go of the case entirely. He still thinks about it. He still wakes up some mornings with theories, with ideas about where the bodies might be. He's contacted Detective Alvarez several times with suggestions, places to search, angles to consider. He knows he'll never fully let it go. He knows that Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes will be with him for the rest of his life. When he closes his eyes, he sees their faces in the photographs their mothers provided, smiling, innocent, alive. He thinks about the fact that he never got to meet them, never got to know them as anything other than victims. He wishes he could have known them as children, as people, before they became a case file. He says the hardest part of working cold cases is living with the ones you solve but can't fully close. Nathan Lawson is in prison. Justice has been served in the legal sense. But without the girls' bodies, without that final piece of closure, the case feels incomplete. It feels like a book with the last chapter missing. Lucas has attended the memorial services at the park a few times over the years. He stands at the back, not wanting to intrude on the family's grief, but wanting to pay his respects. Jennifer Morrison noticed him once and came over, thanked him for never giving up. She said he'd given them something they never thought they'd have, the knowledge of who took their daughters, the certainty that justice had been done. Lucas told her he was sorry it took so long. Jennifer shook her head. She said 12 years was a long time to wait, but it was better than never knowing at all. That conversation stayed with Lucas. It reminded him why he'd spent so much of his career on cold cases, why he'd refused to let this one go. Because for the families, even delayed justice matters. Even partial answers matter. Even the smallest step toward truth matters when you've been living in uncertainty for years. There's a broader question this case raises, one that extends beyond Springfield, beyond Ohio, beyond this particular tragedy. What do we owe to the dead? What do we owe to the families of the missing? We owe them memory. We owe them the refusal to look away, to move on, to forget just because time has passed and the story is no longer new. We owe them the commitment to keep searching, keep asking questions, keep holding space for their grief. We owe them the understanding that justice delayed is not the same as justice denied, but it's also not the same as justice served cleanly and completely. It's its own complicated thing, better than nothing, but still painful, still imperfect. And we owe them the truth, whatever that truth might be, however long it takes to uncover it. The truth in this case is that Nathan Lawson took 2 little girls from a front yard in broad daylight and killed them. The truth is that he hid their bodies somewhere they haven't been found. The truth is that he's shown no remorse, offered no explanation, provided no closure. The truth is that 2 families have been living with a hole in their lives for more than 18 years, and that hole will never be filled. But the truth is also that the case was solved. That someone finally spoke up. That the person responsible is behind bars. That Kayla and Brianna's names are still spoken, their memories still honored, their lives still acknowledged as having mattered. That has to count for something. Jennifer Morrison was asked in a 2023 interview if she'd forgiven Nathan Lawson. She thought about the question for a long time before answering. She said forgiveness was complicated. She said she didn't think she could forgive him for what he'd done, for taking Kayla, for killing her, for refusing to say where she was. But she also said she didn't spend much time thinking about Nathan anymore. She said she preferred to think about Kayla. About who Kayla was, not how she died. About the joy Kayla brought into the world in her 5 short years. About the way she laughed, the way she loved animals, the way she'd crawl into bed with Jennifer on Saturday mornings and they'd read stories together. She said Nathan Lawson had taken enough. He'd taken Kayla's life. He'd taken 12 years of not knowing. He wasn't going to take her memories too. He wasn't going to take the love she still felt for her daughter. He didn't get to have that power. Lisa Hayes said something similar. She said she used to be consumed by anger at Nathan. She'd imagine confronting him, demanding answers, making him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused. But over time, the anger had dulled into something else, not forgiveness, exactly, but a kind of tired acceptance. She said she'd learned that you can't force someone to feel remorse. You can't make someone care that they've destroyed lives. All you can do is decide that they won't destroy yours any more than they already have. Both women have become advocates for legislative changes related to missing persons cases. They've pushed for laws requiring faster response times for missing children, for better coordination between law enforcement agencies, for more resources dedicated to cold cases. They've testified before state committees, shared their stories with lawmakers, used their grief as fuel for change. In 2021, Ohio passed Kayla and Brianna's Law, which mandates that all law enforcement agencies in the state must issue immediate alerts for missing children under the age of 12, with no waiting period. The law also allocates additional funding for cold case investigations and requires annual training for officers on handling missing persons cases. It won't bring Kayla and Brianna back. But it might save someone else's child. And for Jennifer and Lisa, that matters. That's something they can hold on to. The anniversary dates are always hard. July 14th. The day the girls disappeared. The families have a routine now. They gather at the memorial bench. They bring flowers, yellow for Kayla, pink for Brianna. They tell stories. They cry. They hold each other. And then they go home and try to make it through another year. Sometimes people ask them how they do it. How they keep going. How they find the strength to get out of bed every morning and face a world where their daughters don't exist anymore. Jennifer says she doesn't have a good answer to that question. She says you just do. You wake up because the sun comes up. You keep breathing because your body doesn't give you a choice. And somewhere along the way, you find small reasons to keep living, a sunset, a conversation with a friend, a moment of laughter that surprises you by showing up uninvited. Lisa says grief becomes part of you. It doesn't go away, and you stop waiting for it to. You just learn to carry it. Some days it's heavier than others. Some days you can barely feel it. But it's always there, and eventually, you make peace with that. The search for Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes continues, even now. Every few years, there's a renewed effort. New technology becomes available: ground-penetrating radar, advanced cadaver dogs, satellite imaging. Each time, the families allow themselves to hope. Each time, they're disappointed. But they don't give up. They can't. As long as Kayla and Brianna are out there somewhere, as long as there's even the smallest possibility that they could be found and brought home, the families will keep searching. Jennifer Morrison has said she's made peace with the possibility that she might never find Kayla. She says it's not what she wants, but she's had to accept it as a possibility. She says what matters most is that Kayla is remembered. That her life meant something. That she existed, and she was loved, and she mattered. Lisa Hayes says she'll never stop looking for Brianna. She says she can't. She says even if it takes the rest of her life, even if she's 90 years old and can barely walk, she'll still be out there searching. Because that's what mothers do. They don't give up on their children. Ever. The people who knew Kayla and Brianna, the teachers who taught them in preschool, the neighbors who watched them play, the extended family members who loved them, carry their own versions of this grief. They remember the girls in different ways, through different lenses. A teacher remembers Kayla's love of picture books. A neighbor remembers Brianna's shyness, the way she'd hide behind her mother's legs when spoken to. An aunt remembers both girls at a family picnic, running through the grass with their cousins, covered in dirt and happiness. These memories are precious. They're all that's left. In 2024, on what would have been Kayla and Brianna's 22nd birthday, a group of their childhood friends, now adults, organized a fundraiser for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They raised more than $15,000. They said they wanted to do something, to feel less helpless, to honor their friends in a way that might help other families avoid the same nightmare. The event was held at a community center in Springfield. Jennifer Morrison and Lisa Hayes attended. They spoke briefly, thanking everyone for remembering their daughters, for caring enough to take action. They said it meant everything to know that Kayla and Brianna hadn't been forgotten, that their lives still inspired people to be better, to do more, to care about children they'd never met. There were no dry eyes in that room. This case will never be fully closed. Not in the legal sense. Nathan Lawson is convicted, sentenced, imprisoned. But in the human sense, in the sense that matters to the families who live with this loss every day, it remains open. It will remain open until Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes are found and brought home. And even then, even if that day comes, even if their remains are discovered and they can finally be laid to rest with the dignity they deserve, the grief won't end. The loss won't be erased. The years without them won't be given back. But there might be a kind of peace. A completeness. A sense that the circle has been closed as much as it can be. That's what the families hope for. Not happiness, they know better than to hope for that. But peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you did everything you could, that you never gave up, that you honored your children by refusing to let the world forget them. If you think Jennifer Morrison and Lisa Hayes deserve to know the truth about what happened to their daughters, hit that subscribe button. Trolls won't. But people who understand that some fights don't end just because time passes, they will. Nathan Lawson sits in a prison cell in Mansfield, Ohio. Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes remain missing. Two families continue to grieve. And the rest of us are left to reckon with the uncomfortable reality that sometimes evil wins, at least partially. Sometimes the bad guys don't confess. Sometimes the bodies aren't found. Sometimes justice is incomplete, imperfect, insufficient. But here's what I know to be true: the fact that this case was solved at all, after 12 years of silence, is because people refused to give up. Rebecca Lawson found the courage to speak, even though it cost her everything. Detective Raymond Lucas kept the case alive when it would have been easier to let it go cold. The community of Springfield held space for these families' grief and never stopped caring. And Jennifer Morrison and Lisa Hayes woke up every single day for more than a decade and chose to keep fighting, keep hoping, keep believing that someday the truth would surface. That's not nothing. In a world where injustice is common and closure is rare, that's everything. The story of Kayla Morrison and Brianna Hayes is not just a story about two little girls who were taken too soon. It's a story about what happens after. About the people left behind, the community that refuses to forget, the investigators who won't let go, the families who carry on despite carrying a weight that would crush most of us. It's a story about persistence. About love that doesn't end just because life does. About the human capacity to survive the unsurvivable and find meaning in the midst of devastating loss. And it's a story about two little girls who loved butterflies and strawberries and the color yellow. Who were shy and kind and full of laughter. Who played in a front yard on a summer morning and deserved to grow up, to have futures, to become whoever they were meant to be. They didn't get that chance. But we can make sure they're not forgotten. We can make sure their names are spoken, their stories told, their lives acknowledged. We can refuse to look away from uncomfortable truths just because they're uncomfortable. That's what we owe them. That's what we owe all the missing, all the lost, all the ones who never came home. Rest in peace, Kayla Morrison. Rest in peace, Brianna Hayes. You were loved. You are remembered. You will never be forgotten. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. The truth doesn't disappear just because it's buried. Sometimes it takes years to surface. Sometimes it takes someone finding the courage to speak. Sometimes it takes a detective who refuses to give up. But eventually, in ways we can't always predict, the truth finds its way into the light. And when it does, it matters. Even decades late. Even incomplete. Even imperfect. It matters. I'll see you in the next one.